Thessalien, autumn 1453. The bells of Sankt Katarinas convent rang for the last time, as Sister Eleni pressed her palm against the cold stone wall of the chapel. Through the narrow window slit, she could see what the other nuns refused to look at. Ottoman banners flowing like blood across the hillside, moving steadily toward their gates. 22 women knelt behind her in prayer, their voices barely audible over the wind that carried the smell of distant smoke. They had heard what happened to the convents at Mistras, at Mistra, at Ioannina. The stories always began the same way: soldiers, screams, silence. But those stories never said what came after the silence, what happened to the women who survived the conquest, but not their captors' mercy. The empire you thought you knew, the one in history textbooks, with magnificent architecture and brilliant military strategy, that's only half the story. Behind the golden mosaics and poetic chronicles lay systematic policies that turned holy women into trophies, that transformed convents into hunting grounds, and that reduced Christian nuns to commodities in a marketplace of faith and flesh. What happened to Sister Eleni and her sisters wasn't an isolated atrocity or the chaos of war. It was documented procedure, recorded in Ottoman administrative archives that still survive today, preserved in the registry books called defter that tracked human beings with the same bureaucratic precision applied to livestock and grain shipments. Subscribe now if you want the untold truth about how empires actually functioned, because what you're about to discover comes directly from Ottoman court records, Venetian diplomatic cables, and Vatican investigative reports that spent centuries buried in archives across 3 continents. This isn't speculation or legend. This is what the documents prove. The first cannonball struck the convent wall at sunset. The impact sent limestone dust cascading through the chapel like demonic snow, coating the frescoes of saints whose faces had already been worn smooth by centuries of devotion. Sister Eleni felt the floor shudder beneath her knees. She had been praying the same verse for 3 hours since the Ottoman scouts first appeared on the ridge. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. She didn't finish. The second impact shattered the gate. The Ottoman assault on Christian religious institutions followed documented tactical patterns, recorded in military manuals that survive in Istanbul's Topkapi-paladset archives. Cannons first, not to breach, but to terrorize. The psychological impact of hearing stone walls crumble was more valuable than the physical damage. It announced that no sanctuary was sacred, no vow could protect, no God would intervene. The sound was the message. When the third impact collapsed part of the chapel roof, the youngest nun, Sister Magdalena, barely 16, began to sob. Not from fear of death, but from watching the silver crucifix that had hung above the altar for 200 years crash to the floor and bend, as if their faith itself was being broken before their eyes. Sister Eleni gathered them in the center of the chapel as dust continued to fall, and male voices, shouting in Turkish, barking commands, grew louder outside. She held the bent crucifix in her hands. The metal was still warm from where it had caught the last rays of sunlight through the shattered roof. She spoke the only words that made sense. If they take our bodies, they cannot take our souls. Hold to your vows. God sees even what men try to hide. But Sister Diris, the eldest at 63, knew better. She had lived through the fall of Thessalonica in 1430. She had heard the testimonies of survivors from other convents. She knew that what was coming was designed specifically to break the one thing Sister Eleni promised could not be broken. By dawn, the convent was ash and rubble. Ottoman flags flew from the bell tower where prayers had echoed for 3 centuries. But the 22 women who had prayed there weren't dead. They were bound in the courtyard, surrounded by soldiers. And what happened next was recorded not as tragedy, but as administrative procedure in documents that still exist. Documents that tracked these women like inventory, assigned them numerical values, and determined their fates based on calculations that had nothing to do with mercy. The Ottoman captain who commanded the assault was named Mehmed Bey, and we know his name because he signed the requisition forms that survive in the Imperial Treasury records, catalogue number Maliyeden Müdever 7851. These documents, discovered in the 1920s and partially translated, list everything taken from Sankt Katarinas convent. 43 silver candlesticks, 18 embroidered vestments, 1 large crucifix, melted for coin, and 22 female captives, ages 14 to 63, religious designation, Christian nuns. The women were herded into the courtyard as smoke still rose from the refectory. They stood in their white habits, now stained with dust and blood, under a sky turning purple with sunset. Around them, soldiers sorted through the convent's possessions, loading wagons with anything valuable. The bent crucifix Sister Eleni had held went into a sack destined for the nearest mint. Mehmed Bey walked slowly down the line of women, studying each face. He stopped in front of Sister Eleni. Through a translator, a Greek convert who looked everywhere except at the nun's eyes, he made an offer. If she renounced Christ and accepted Allah, if she publicly converted before her sisters, they would all be spared and given positions as servants in respectable Ottoman households. It was, the translator emphasized, an act of mercy rarely extended to conquered enemies. Sister Eleni's response was recorded in multiple sources, including a letter from a Venetian merchant who later interviewed survivors. She said, "I have already given my life to God. What else can you take?" The captain stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his men and spoke a single word in Turkish. "Devam," continue. What followed wasn't the quick death that medieval warfare sometimes granted. It was the beginning of a systematic process designed to break these women spiritually before using them physically. The Ottoman military administration had learned through decades of conquest that simply killing religious captives created martyrs. But transforming them, making them renounce their faith, destroying their sense of sacred identity, that was a victory that echoed beyond the battlefield. They didn't kill Sister Eleni that night. Instead, she was separated from the others and taken to a tent where Ottoman officers were drinking wine, forbidden by their own faith, but consumed freely in the chaos of conquest. What happened in that tent wasn't recorded in official documents, but 6 months later, a Vatican investigator traveling through the region collected testimonies from villagers who had been forced to serve the Ottoman camp. Their accounts, preserved in Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, Section 9, Box 47, describe screams that lasted until dawn. By morning, Sister Eleni was gone. Whether she was killed, died from her wounds, or was taken separately, the records don't specify. What they do specify is that the remaining 21 women began the march south toward the coast, bound together by ropes at the wrists, watched by mounted soldiers. The journey from Thessaly to the port of Volos took 7 days, covering approximately 120 kilometers of mountain roads. Ottoman military logistics documents, the Menzil Defterleri or way station registers, tracked the movement of troops and captives through the empire with bureaucratic precision. These registers recorded where units stopped, what supplies they consumed, and what assets they transported. In the register for September 1453, there's an entry. 21 Christian women, religious captives, condition, serviceable, destination, Constantinople slave market. The women walked in their torn habits. When one fell from exhaustion, Sister Anna, aged 47, who had served the convent for 30 years, the others tried to lift her. The soldiers allowed this because damaged goods brought lower prices. They needed these women alive and relatively intact for the markets. At night, they were kept in village storehouses or sometimes simply bound in open fields under guard. They weren't fed regularly. The supply allocation for religious captives was minimal in Ottoman logistics planning. When villagers tried to give them food or water, soldiers prevented it. Not from cruelty, but from documented policy. Keeping captives weak reduced escape attempts and resistance. Sister Magdalena, the youngest, whispered psalms under her breath. The older women tried to shield her from the soldiers' attention, forming a circle around her whenever the camp settled. They understood that beauty and youth made her the most valuable, and therefore the most endangered. The Ottoman slave markets operated on clear hierarchical pricing that later Venetian observers documented. Young women commanded premium prices, particularly if they were Christian and could be converted or used to demonstrate Islamic dominance over Christian faith. When they reached Volos on the 7th day, the port town was already filling with other captives, Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, all destined for the slave markets of Constantinople. The nuns were loaded onto a galley, their wrists shackled to wooden benches in the cargo hold, where light barely penetrated, and the air smelled of salt, sweat, and previous occupants' despair. The ship's manifest still exists, preserved in the Ottoman Naval Archives, Catalogue Bahriye Defterleri, Volume 12. Among entries for grain, weapons, and captured military equipment, there's a line item. Religious women, 21 units, origin. Thessaly, estimated value, 4,200 akçe. Each woman was worth approximately 200 akçe, roughly the price of a decent horse. The document doesn't list their names. It lists their ages, physical condition, and whether they were virgins. This detail mattered because Ottoman law had specific provisions about the treatment and pricing of virgins versus non-virgins in the slave trade. The voyage to Constantinople took 12 days. Storms in the Aegean delayed them. Several captives died in the crossing. The ship's manifest was updated with a notation: 3 losses, natural causes, which in Ottoman administrative language meant died from conditions aboard ship, but not deliberately killed, so no financial liability to the captain. When the galley finally entered the Bosphorus Strait, Sister Diris, who had remained silent for most of the journey, looked up at the skyline of Constantinople rising before them. The great dome of Hagia Sophia, the cathedral that had been the heart of Eastern Christianity for 1,000 years, now had minarets. The cross that had crowned its peak was gone, replaced with the crescent of Islam. She whispered to Sister Magdalena, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." They were unloaded at the docks near Eminonu, where the slave markets operated openly. Ottoman law permitted slavery of non-Muslims captured in warfare, and the legal framework was sophisticated. The Kanuname legal codes, compiled under Mehmed II and preserved in multiple manuscript copies, specified how captives should be registered, valued, and sold. Religious captives, priests, monks, nuns, had special provisions because they represented symbolic victories over Christianity itself. The 21 women were marched through Constantinople's streets toward the imperial district, not to be immediately sold, but to be processed through the Divan-ı Humayun, the imperial council, where their disposition would be officially determined. This wasn't chaos or the randomness of conquest. This was bureaucratic procedure applied to human beings. They were forced to kneel in a marble courtyard as scribes prepared to record their information. The Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister, sat on an elevated platform, flanked by officials whose job was to categorize and assign captives based on imperial needs and market values. Through a translator, the women were informed that the Sultan, in his mercy, would grant them life and positions within the imperial household if they converted to Islam. Those who converted would receive new names, new clothing, and roles as palace servants. Those who refused would be sent to the slave markets, where their futures would be determined by whoever purchased them. Sister Dearest, weakened by the journey, but unbowed in spirit, rose despite the guard's attempts to keep her kneeling. She addressed the Grand Vizier in Greek, knowing he would understand, even if he pretended not to. The translator hesitated, unsure whether to repeat her words. When he finally did, his voice shook. "My lord, you may strip us of our habits and give us new names, but the prayers we carry in our hearts, those you cannot take. We are brides of Christ, and no earthly master can change that vow." The Grand Vizier's response was recorded in the council minutes, which survive in fragmentary form in the Topkapi archives. Faith that refuses reason will be taught through discipline. Take them to the lower chambers. The lower chambers weren't dungeons in the traditional sense. They were a complex of underground rooms beneath Topkapi Palace, where unclassified captives were held while their fates were decided. And what happened in those chambers over the following months reveals the systematic nature of Ottoman policy toward religious captives, a policy designed not to kill, but to break, to transform holy women into symbols of Islamic triumph over Christianity. The chambers were accessed through a narrow staircase that descended from the palace gardens. Stone walls, perpetually damp. Narrow ventilation slits that allowed a sliver of daylight, but never warmth. Each room was perhaps 3 meters square, barely large enough for the women who were packed inside. They were stripped of their habits. That detail appears in multiple survivor accounts, later collected by Catholic missionaries. Given rough wool garments that marked them as servants of the palace, their hair was cut short, removing another marker of their religious identity. And they were assigned numbers, not names, to be used when guards addressed them. The work was deliberately degrading, scrubbing floors in parts of the palace reserved for horses and animals, carrying waste, hauling water. The intention wasn't simply to use their labor. The palace had thousands of servants who could do these tasks more efficiently. The intention was to break their sense of sacred identity by forcing them to perform tasks that Christian religious doctrine considered particularly unclean. But the Ottoman administrators underestimated them. These were women who had lived under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, who had fasted, prayed through night vigils, and found spiritual meaning in physical denial. Degrading labor wasn't foreign to them. It was their discipline made visible. They began to pray in secret. At night, after the palace slept, they would gather in whispers. Sister Magdalena, whose memory was exceptional, began to recite psalms from memory. Sister Dearest, who had studied Latin, reconstructed fragments of the Mass. They had no Bibles, no prayer books, no rosaries, but they had their voices and their memories, and those became their weapons against erasure. One of them, accounts don't specify who, carved a tiny cross into the stone wall using her fingernail, working night after night until the symbol was barely visible, but unmistakably there. Another traced verses from John's Gospel into the dust beneath her sleeping mat, words that would be erased by feet and wind, but that she rewrote every evening. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. After 3 months of this, recorded in palace supply logs that tracked rations given to the Greek captives, The Ottoman administrators changed tactics. If degrading labor wouldn't break them, perhaps kindness would. They were moved to better quarters, given improved food, allowed to bathe. Learned imams visited them, speaking gently about Islam, explaining that Christianity and Islam worshipped the same God, that conversion was simply accepting a fuller truth. This wasn't mercy. It was phase 2 of systematic psychological manipulation. The Ottoman approach to converting religious captives was sophisticated and documented across multiple sources. First, destroy their sense of sacred identity through degradation. Then, when they're broken down, offer restoration through conversion. The physical misery, followed by apparent kindness, created a psychological dynamic where conversion seemed like salvation rather than surrender. Some of the women wavered. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins named Maria and Elena. Their names survive in a Venetian diplomatic report from 1454, finally accepted conversion after 6 months. They were given Turkish names dressed in silk and taken to the harem as low-ranking servants. They were never seen again by the other captives. Each disappearance hardened the resolve of those who remained. They understood that conversion meant not just changing religion, but disappearing completely, becoming absorbed into the Ottoman system, where their Christian identities would be erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Sister Dearest, growing thinner and paler each week, began to lead them in a new form of resistance. When guards questioned them, they stopped speaking. When ordered to work, they moved in perfect silence, completing tasks but offering no words, no acknowledgement, no recognition of their captor's authority over their souls, even if their bodies could be commanded. The palace scribes recorded this phenomenon with confusion. One administrative note from early 1454, discovered in the Maliyedan Mudeva registers, states, "The Greek women have ceased speech. They complete assigned labor, but respond to no questions. Recommend reassignment or disposal, as they provide no intelligence value and cannot be satisfactorily converted." Disposal was Ottoman administrative language for execution or sale to the lowest tier of slave markets, brothels and labor camps, where life expectancy was measured in months. But before that recommendation could be acted upon, something remarkable happened. The women discovered something that would become their final act of defiance, and the evidence that would survive 5 centuries. In the labyrinth of underground passages beneath Topkapi-paladset, there were forgotten rooms, storage chambers sealed decades earlier, when palace renovations changed the building's layout. One of the nuns, exploring during a rare moment unsupervised, found a doorway hidden behind stacked wooden crates. Behind it was a small chamber, perhaps 4 meters square, with a ventilation shaft that led up through the palace foundations. Dry, hidden, forgotten. They began using it as their chapel. From broken pottery they made candle holders. From a scrap of torn linen, an altar cloth. From a shard of shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude cross by scratching away the silver backing to leave only the cross-shaped glass. In this space, barely large enough for them to kneel together, they reconstructed their faith from memory and improvisation. Every night after the palace slept, they would slip one by one into this hidden chamber. No hymns, sound carried through stone corridors. Instead, they prayed in whispers, each woman sharing a memory. A church bell's sound, the smell of incense, the taste of communion bread. These memories became their liturgy, small offerings to a God who still listened in darkness. Sister Magdalena began marking the walls with charcoal. She couldn't write names. If discovered, names would identify them for punishment. So she drew birds. 1 small bird for each woman still alive. When a bird disappeared from the count, it meant another sister had been taken, converted, sold, or died. By the time spring arrived, only 11 birds remained. But they also wrote other things. Latin phrases scratched into the stone with sharpened pottery fragments. Lux in tenebris lucet, the light shines in darkness. Non nobis Domine, not unto us, O Lord. And most powerfully, a verse from Psalm 137, scratched deep enough to survive centuries. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. They never intended these carvings to be discovered. They were prayers, not messages. Acts of faith performed in a darkness so complete that even the women making them couldn't see the words they carved. But darkness preserves what light destroys. And 500 years later, when archaeologists excavating beneath Topkapi-paladset foundations discovered a sealed chamber lined with Christian symbols, they found evidence that rewrote what historians thought they knew about the Ottoman conquest's forgotten victims. In 1963, during renovations of Topkapi-paladset, workers broke through a sealed wall and discovered a small chamber that wasn't on any palace architectural plans. Inside, beneath centuries of dust, were Christian religious carvings. Dozens of them, scratched into every available surface with such desperation that some symbols were carved over other symbols when space ran out. The Turkish government initially kept the discovery quiet. It complicated the historical narrative of the Ottoman conquest. But by the 1980s, Western scholars had gained access to the site. Archaeological analysis dated the carvings to the mid-15th century, precisely the period when the nuns from Thessaly would have been held in the palace. The carvings included crosses, Latin prayers, and most remarkably, a series of small bird symbols arranged in declining numbers. 11 birds grouped together, 12 birds with one scratched out, 13 with 2 marked for removal. Reading backward, the sequence suggested 22 women, whose number decreased systematically over months or years. Byzantine art historians identified the carving style as consistent with female religious communities in 15th century Greece. Theological experts translated the fragmentary Latin inscriptions. And forensic archaeologists determined that some of the carvings were made with fingernails rather than tools. The stone bore microscopic traces of keratin embedded in the scratches. The evidence was undeniable. This chamber had been a secret chapel, maintained by Christian women held captive beneath the palace, who had carved their faith into stone, knowing they might never be discovered, but unable to stop themselves from marking this space as holy. What happened to the 11 survivors? Ottoman palace records from 1455 provide a partial answer. In the Topkapi Saray Musesi Archivi, there's a notation dated April 1455. Greek captives, religious class, 11 remaining. Recommend transfer to provincial service or market disposal. Conversion efforts unsuccessful after 18 months. A Venetian diplomatic report from June 1455, preserved in the Archivio di Stato di Venezia, mentions that a group of Christian women, number unspecified, were sold at Constantinopel slave markets to provincial buyers. Their destination was recorded as Bursa textile workshops, which were known to use female slave labor in particularly harsh conditions. That's where the official trail ends. No further records mention them. No names appear. They simply vanish from documentation. But there are fragments. A Franciscan missionary traveling through Anatolia in 1458 recorded in his journal that he encountered an elderly Greek woman working in a Bursa silk workshop who claimed to have been a nun before the conquest. She told him she still prayed the Mass from memory every night, though she hadn't seen a priest or received communion in 5 years. When he offered to hear her confession, she wept and said she had nothing to confess. She had kept her vows even in captivity. He didn't record her name, only that she died shortly after their meeting. A second account comes from an Ottoman court record from 1461, found in the Bursa Sharia Sicileri, the Islamic court registers. It mentions a complaint filed by a workshop owner about a Christian slave who had taught other slaves to pray in Latin, creating religious disturbance. The slave was sentenced to 20 lashes and transferred to another workshop. The name is given only as Magdalena the Greek. If this was Sister Magdalena, and the name, origin, and religious behavior suggest it might have been, then she survived at least 8 years after the conquest, still teaching prayers, still refusing to abandon her faith, despite everything the Ottoman system had done to break her. The story of what happened to Christian nuns in the Ottoman conquest isn't speculation or anti-Islamic propaganda. It's documented in Ottoman administrative registers that tracked captives like inventory Venetian diplomatic cables that reported on slave market operations, Vatican investigative reports compiled from survivor testimonies, archaeological evidence discovered beneath Topkapi-paladset court records from multiple Ottoman cities documenting Christian slaves, missionary journals describing encounters with survivors. These sources paint a consistent picture. Christian religious women captured during the conquest faced systematic policies designed to break their faith through degradation, isolation, forced conversion attempts, and ultimately disposal when conversion failed. They weren't simply killed. That would have been too quick. They were processed through a bureaucratic system that treated them as problems to be solved through re-education, or failing that, through absorption into the lowest tiers of the slave economy. Some did convert. The records prove that. Some disappeared into the Ottoman system, took new names, lived new lives. Whether they did so willingly or under duress, we cannot know. Others resisted until death or until documentation ceased recording their existence. But beneath the palace, in darkness so complete they couldn't see their own hands, a group of women carved prayers into stone. Not because anyone would see them, not because it would change their circumstances, but because faith, real faith, not the ritualized performance that empires understand, doesn't require witnesses or rewards. It requires only the conviction that something matters more than survival. The hidden chapel beneath Topkapi-paladset is not open to the public. Turkish authorities consider it a sensitive site, complicating official narratives about the conquest. But scholars who have accessed it describe an experience that transcends historical interest. Standing in that small space, seeing crosses scratched into stone by fingernails, reading Latin prayers carved in desperation, counting the diminishing bird symbols that mark 22 women becoming 11, becoming none. One archaeologist who worked on the site wrote, "I am not a religious man, but standing in that chamber, I felt the presence of something that refused to die. 500 years ago, women prayed here in darkness, leaving behind the only thing their captors couldn't take, the evidence that they never surrendered." If this story moved you, if it made you see the Ottoman conquest differently, subscribe now. Because there are dozens of similar stories buried in archives across Europe and Turkey, documented in registers and diplomatic reports and missionary journals. Stories of how empires actually functioned, what conquest actually meant, and who paid the real price for military glory celebrated in history books. Comment below and tell us, should these stories be taught in schools? Should the archaeological evidence beneath Topkapi be made public? Or are some historical truths too uncomfortable to confront? The women who carved those prayers into stone never expected to be remembered. They did it for God, for themselves, for the preservation of something they believed mattered more than life. But they were remembered, not by the empire that tried to erase them, but by the stone that held their faith when nothing else could. Lux in tenebris lucet. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.